Orion Caro stabbed the pillow. The room held the stubborn damp of night, the sort of moisture that clung to the bones and never let go. A smell of iron and old soap and cold wool that drifted in with the breeze from the crack beneath the window. He woke with a soundless start, shoulders knotting as if the weight of 100 fallen men pressed him from behind. The bed creaked with the effort of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to lie still when the world demanded to be remembered aloud. In the pale glimmer of the oil lamp, his hands found the pillow, the linen rough and familiar against his skin, and he stabbed it once, then again, as if silencing a chorus of ghosts with every thrust. Orion Caro's breath rasped in the room, a dry, gritty thing that scraped his throat. He listened, felt the quiet of the old house push back against the tremor in his chest. The stinging copper tang of fear was always there, a shadow that never left, and tonight it clung to his lips like something thick and metallic that refused to be coughed away. The night air carried a scent of turpentine from a bottle of liniment left on a dresser, and the pillow, pacifist in its inert demand to simply be rested upon, felt suddenly like a scoreboard on which the past kept its tally. He had learned a long time ago that sleep did not come to him as a gift. It came as a battle, a new engagement to be fought with the same stubborn stiffness with which he had carried a rifle in fields he would never again name aloud. The veterans' home, the old house on the hill that wore its weather like a badge, stood behind him with its own dark expectations. He could hear the clock in the hall, a patient, stubborn tick that seemed to mock him, counting the seconds in a language only the broken could understand. A single lamp burned. The nurse's door stood a pace away, ajar just enough for a whisper of light to slip into his room and lay a pale finger on the edge of his mind. The nurse did not move, not yet, but Orion could hear the soft shuffle of her shoes on the creaky floor, as if she were a ghostly footstep in the margin of a memory. "Sir?" The voice came at last, cautious but steady, a sound that had learned to ride the creases of fear rather than crash through them. "It's me again. Can you tell me if you're all right?" The sentence hung between them, a line drawn in chalk across a blackboard that did not want to remain clean. He did not answer at first. The pillow gave a dull, hollow sigh under the force of his grip, the cotton fibers shifting and scattering like tiny bones. I'm here," he whispered, though the words felt distant, as if they belonged to a younger man in a different room, a gentler night, just the same as last night, just the same as the night before. The nurse stepped closer, the scent of soap and antiseptic wafting with her movement. She did not touch him, not this night. She held the boundary with practiced care, a shield against the tremor in his hands and the tremor in the world outside. Her voice slipped around him, soft and bright as a lamp's halo. "You've been waking every night, sir. Is it the old war again, the old injuries?" she asked, a phrase loaded with caution she did not need to phrase so carefully, because she had learned the syntax of souls as much as the medical notes on a chart. "A war that never ends," he replied, surprising himself with how even his voice could sound when measured against the windshield of fear that separated him from the night. The words felt old in his mouth, like cracked leather warmed by a final, stubborn sun. The nurse's sigh was a small sound, a measured mixture of sympathy and professional duty. "Tell me about the dream, if you can," she offered. "Describe it to me. Not to me alone, but to the room that's listening." He turned his head just enough to catch a glimmer of her, a woman in her 30s with hair drawn back tight, a line of chalk on her brow to keep the glare from her eyes, a steady pulse beating at her neck as if a small drum kept her courage in rhythm. He could smell the faint tang of peppermint on her breath, the cleanliness of her skin, the quiet resolve that kept her from stepping away when a patient's memory turned into a storm. "3 nurses," he began, and the word landed with a dull weight, the air thickening around it as if the word itself carried a memory heavy enough to press the ceiling down. "3 women who tended me after the wound that should have finished me. They were taken by the night in a way that has nothing to do with mercy." The room listened with him. The clock kept its patient time. The lamp hummed. "That night," he continued, voice lower, "we were in a field hospital, shelled by the wrong kind of thunder and heat, the kind that makes the air taste like iron and fear. They moved with the care of angels, who knew the difference between a man who would live and a man who would forget his own name. They worked with hands stained by something heavier than blood, the weight of decisions that saved lives and haunted souls." He paused, the memory arriving with the gravity of a distant cannon roar, muffled by distance but no less real for its distance. The nurse did not interrupt him, though the words sharped the air around them, like knives drawn from silk. She set down a tin cup, the metal singing gently on the wood as if it was percussion in a quiet song. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. He shook his head, a small tremor going through him, an echo that ran through knowable time. "The 3 nurses didn't survive the night. Not the night in the memory. The night of the rain and the guns, they tried to save me, and in doing so were lost to the confusion and the sound." His breath hitched on the edges of the word. "I killed them in the memory, not with a blade now, but with the fear that owned me." The nurse's eyes widened ever so slightly, recognizing the gravity of what he admitted, not the act, but the memory's consumption of him. She spoke with care, a clinical tenderness that belongs to those who treat ghosts as much as flesh. "Orion, you're safe here, in this room with the lamp and the pillow to anchor you. The war is not here. The war is inside your head. We know that. We've seen it. The memory doesn't own you. You own it in spite of the night's long questions." He did not smile. Smiles were rare in the rooms of memory's night, yet there was a trace of something like relief, a frost of relief that came from being understood, if only for a breath. Outside, the night made its soft, indifferent sounds, the rustle of a branch against the window, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint murmur of rain against a metal gutter. The scent of damp earth and old wood drifted in with the draught, as if the house itself exhaled a sigh of relief, that he stayed, that the memory did not swallow him whole. In the hours that followed, the nurse sat with him in a pattern that became their quiet ritual. She would speak with a careful restraint, and he would answer with a truth that sounded heavy on his tongue, and the pillow would bear his strain as if it could understand the weight of what the human head carried. The night moved on. Orion's mind wandered the memory's path with the slow mercy of a river that knows the banks but refuses to forget the stones. He was in a makeshift hospital tent near a wooded slope, the air thick with smoke and the smell of linseed oil and leather. The 3 nurses moved with the exacting grace of people who had learned to walk around the wounded sphere as if it were a minefield. They did not push. They coaxed life back into him, a life he did not know how to keep for himself. The memory's scene shifted, not like a film changing reels, but more like a book reopening a page that had been written in another lifetime. A man with a coat too worn and eyes too tired knelt by him, a nurse's hand pressing against his chest to keep him from slipping away into the dark. They spoke in a language of quick breaths and firm cadence. "Stay with us," the voice of the nurse said, a human line drawn through the chaos. "Stay with us, you're not dying, you're healing." The other nurse murmured something to her, a whispered exchange that Orion could not quite hear, but it carried the weight of a promise. In his waking life, the nurse's voice drifted back into the present, like a memory made soft by distance. He could hear the practical, steady tone of the present-day caregiver, the nurse here at the threshold of dawn, with a glass of tepid water in hand and a small loaf of stale bread on the nightstand, the scent of lemon soap on her wrists. "You're safe," she repeated, and the words were enough to anchor the frayed edges of his psyche for another night. The hours ticked by in a pale, patient way, and Orion listened to their rhythm. The click of a medical cabinet being closed, the soft rasp of a sheet as someone rearranged his body to ease his pain, the quiet exhale as the lamp's flame wavered and found its center again. In the rising hours, the older man's thoughts turned toward a familiar discipline, narrow, practical, and almost ritual. He began to count the nights in the way a soldier counted days between battles. 1, 2, 3. A cadence that steadied the breath, if not the nerves. Night after night they continued this exchange, the memory and the nurse, the present and the past, a string pulled taut between 2 distant times. Orion clung to the pillow as if it were a shield, and the nurse held the thread in her palm, coaxing the thread to knit a more peaceful pattern than the one his mind kept insisting on. Rising action swelled with a quiet intensity. The veterans' room, stained with the late centuries of smoke and rain and the salt from a life well fought, became a fortress of memory and present. The 3 nurses remained the anchor of the dream, and the memory of their courage kept his eyelids from closing with the ease of sleep. Even as his body begged for rest, a second night's memory entered with a gentler assault, as if the rain had loosened a bit, and the wind carried away some of the smoke that had long clung to the tents and wards. The field hospital orderlies shuffled in a corridor of canvas and daylight that never quite found them, their voices low as they spoke of the wounded and the dead. The nurses moved with the same cautious grace, but now the memory carried a thread of mercy with it. The 3 nurses in this iteration did not merely tend. They consoled. They whispered a lullaby of safer tides and stronger hearts that would endure the next storm. Orion's mouth tasted of stale coffee and something sharper, raw adrenaline. Perhaps that had never quite left its taste on his tongue. The present nurse watched him, not as a patient to be corrected, but as a man to be understood, his gaze tracing the line of his jaw, the tension around his eyes, the way his breath caught when the memory pressed again, pressing the moment into a truth he could not deny. "Tell me what the memory does to you now," she asked, not with accusation, but with a clinical curiosity that mixed with a secret tenderness. He took a breath and let it out slow, as if he could measure his own fear by the rhythm of his exhale. "It is a door," he said at last, not loud but precise. "A door I must open to pass through, even if what lies beyond is not mine to own. Not any more, except in the way it shapes the man I am now." The nurse nodded, understanding that he spoke not of doors, but of the corridors of memory that never truly close. "And the pillow," she pressed, keeping the focus anchored in the ordinary, the tactile. "The pillow is my border," he admitted, tracing a finger along the edge of the linen, feeling it rough under his skin. "It absorbs the impact of a night that I cannot rearrange. If I strike it, I do not harm you or the others who stand at my door in the day. But the pillow bears the weight I cannot bear without something in between, the soft, forgiving fabric that takes a hit and forgives it." The present-day scene held there for a long moment, the 2 of them listening to the room breathe. Outside, a dog barked distantly, and somewhere a train passed with a steady, unfamiliar clatter, the kind of sound that imprints a memory as surely as a photograph imprints a moment. In the room, the plant in the corner shook faintly with a draught, the leaves brushing together with a faint, dry rustle, the room's only accidental music. The 3rd night began with a different mood, a kind of careful, almost religious insistence on keeping the night quiet and the memory at bay. The nurse had learned not to push him when the memory arrived in its full, dangerous clarity. Instead, she invited him to talk of smaller, more manageable things that would not threaten to undo him. The conversation, like a patient map, kept to the edges of the storm. "What did you do after the nurses were gone?" she asked softly, not prying, simply opening a door that the present allowed to stand ajar. The old man's eyes settled on her for a fraction of a second, assessing whether she would leave him to the room's dark. When she remained, a soft gratitude glinted in his gaze. "I kept the lines of honor," he said, the words coming slow but sure. "I kept to the vow of the box and the flag on the mantel. I did not let their memory drag me under, even when the night tried to pull me down. I moved, I fought, I kept breathing. For a long time I thought breathing would be enough to see me through. But the dreams insisted on calling the breaths by another name. The nurse, who spoke the language of care as easily as she spoke of fever and medicine, answered with a mix of clinical detachment and quiet empathy. "We'll keep the door open for you, Orion. We'll stay with you through the night and the mornings, until you can walk the daylight without feeling the ground tilt under your feet." Her words did not erase the memory, nor the pillow's sting, but they offered a rhythm of safety that the old man could clutch to his chest like a talisman. The pillow remained the stage where a battle continued to be waged, a stage on which the past could still perform its ceremonies, but where the present also stood guard. As the night stretched into weeks, a pattern emerged with a stubborn, almost surgical clarity. The pillow in his hands became less a weapon and more a prop. His body still responded to the memory as if it were a live shell, but he learned to hold it in his own time, to pause, to breathe, to speak. The nurse watched and wrote notes, the ledger of a mind learning to reframe terror as a manageable, if never entirely conquered, portion of life. One evening, a young trainee joined the care team, a quiet observer who did not speak much but listened with the attention of someone who would later tell the story of Orion Caro to others. The trainee's questions were precise yet respectful, an instrument to pry the stubborn lock without breaking the door's frame. Orion did not mind the interruption. It gave him something to talk about besides the old war and the unending night. "Do you remember the weather in the field hospital?" the trainee asked, hoping to understand the environment that had forged the memory into a cathedral of fear. Orion turned his head to the trainee, the skeleton of a smile flickering on his lips, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Weather was the sort that makes your bones ache, and your spirit want to pack up and return to the house you forgot you had," he said. The memory entering through the mouth as easily as it entered through the nose, the sense of damp mud, the sting of rain on a tarred canvas, the wind slicing through tents like a blade. The trainee nodded, understanding that the old soldier's recollections were not a series of incidents, but a continuous, unending corridor in which the past and present never truly separated. The nurse who had tended him for years stood by, listening and guiding him with the soft authority that came from watching memories storm from the safe side of a ward. Then, in a moment the old man could not predict, the memory rose with a different force. He saw again the three nurses, not merely as figures in a wounded landscape, but as people who reached out to him in the moment of greatest danger. In the memory he was losing blood, his own fear sharp as a blade, and they moved around him with the calm speed of angels who had learned the sting of death and kept themselves from falling into it. In that memory, the nurses did not die in a single movement. They fell one after another, their bodies succumbing to the wounds and the chaos that surrounded them. The memory did not give him the luxury of time to grieve. It pressed the weight of responsibility into his chest and demanded that he understand how he could have failed them. Even within the confusion of life and war, the pillow remained a witness to the night's confession, and the room, dim, quiet, and cold, held a new gravity. The memory's deaths were not merely events that had happened long ago. They lay in the present as a responsibility he could not deny, a debt that demanded to be paid with breath, with patience, with a refusal to let the memory swallow him whole. The nurse, no longer a stranger to his ritual but a confidant, placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch firm and gentle. "I do not expect you to forget," she said in a whisper that carried both solace and a challenge. "I only ask that you live with the memory, not let it live through you." Orion heard the words as a thin thread, a lifeline thrown across the abyss. He did not answer with a dramatic statement or a vow, but he exhaled slowly, a long, measured breath that said more than any oath could. The bed creaked again, a witness to the man's effort, and the pillow under his hands became a softer thing, a thing less capable of absorbing the night's storm, yet more capable of enduring it with him. Rising action shifted toward a deeper investigation of the mind's machinery. The old veteran found himself in conversations with the physician who visited the home, an older man, careful and methodical, who asked questions that sounded like listening more than interrogation. The physician spoke of memory as a map, with roads that wound through the valleys of trauma and light that sometimes spilled over the ridges of recollection. "Your mind is a trench dug into the earth," the doctor explained one afternoon, as they sat with coffee that steamed in the warmth of a small stove in the corner of Orion's room. The air tasted faintly of coffee and antiseptic and something like old paper, the scent of a library that has never allowed itself to forget a single book or a single name. "A trench?" Orion asked, his voice only a notch above a whisper. "Yes," the doctor replied, nodding. "With memory as the shelling that keeps happening, and the mind as the defense that must decide when to stand and when to retreat. You've learned to survive through rounds of this, the pillow as your shelter. The question is not whether you can keep the shelter, but how you live under the rain that falls between shelling." Orion considered the metaphor, letting it settle into the corners of his mind where fear lived, and began to have its way with his heart. The nurse stood near the door, listening as an instrument listens to the hum of a violin before it breathes out a note. "What I want," Orion said slowly, "is not to forget them. I want to remember them well enough to hear their voices and not be drowned by the sound of the night." The doctor smiled with that quiet, clinical warmth that had saved more lives than his own hands would ever add me. "Dear too. That is a noble aim, old soldier, and it's possible. Memory can be a guide if we teach it to walk carefully beside us instead of forcing us to march through every battlefield again." This conversation did not erase the night's terror, but it gave him a new instrument with which to face it, a plan to reframe the old stories, to hear the voices, but not let them take the stage away from the present. The pillow remained the stage, but he could decide what acts would be performed there, and who would be allowed to speak. The climax approached with a measured crescendo, not a thunderclap, but a drumline that could be heard only by someone who had learned to listen with the body as well as the ear. One night, the memory rose with the full old terror. The same storm of rain and bullets, the same field hospital's chaos that had sewn the scars into his memory with threads of memory and fear. 3 nurses. The memory returned to them with a precision that was almost clinical. The color of their uniforms, the pattern of their shoes against the dirt and mud, the way their voices rose and fell in those split seconds when life and death pulled at the edge of his breath. They moved as if they had practiced for this night 100 times, the night when every life depended on rapid decisions and the steady hands that could hold a man who had learned to fear the very act of standing. In the flashback, the 3 nurses did not merely tend, they sacrificed. They knelt beside him, their white uniforms stained with the day's grim rain and the night's darker sorrow, their faces pale but determined, their mouths moving in a language of urgent care. A shout, was it a shouted order or the scream of someone in pain, cut across the field? A blade through the memory's film, and the nurse's hands were everywhere at once, preventing the worst from happen. And then came the moment when the storm proved too much, when the world's weight pressed down with the weight of 100 broken men, and the nurses 3 fell one after another, as if in a single breath the night had decided to claim them all. The memory was vivid in its brutality, but it also carried something else, the sense that Orion had not failed them in the moment they had saved him. The doctors, the orderlies, the nurses, people with names he could not recall now, or perhaps did recall in the way one recalls a name from a dream, not fully, but with a shaping memory that remains in the flesh. The memory's closing tremor left him kneeling with the dead weight of the night, and the fear that never leaves a man who has learned to survive by keeping his eyes on the ground. In the present, the room's air seemed to press closer, heavy with the remembered sorrow and the duty of the living to carry it forward. The pillow, once a weapon, lay inert under his hands, its whiteness now not a target but a witness to a new resolve forming within him. The nurse, no longer a mere helper but a witness to his growth, saw what the memory could do when given a gentler hand to guide it. "You are not what you were when you walked out of the field," she said softly, as though stating a simple fact, but there was a slender thread of hope in her voice. "You have carried this far, across years that tried to break you and a night that tried to swallow you. You do not need to prove yourself to it anymore. You can choose how to respond to it." The old veteran looked at her with a gaze that carried centuries in its depth, though his face wore only the lines of a man who had learned to outwait the most stubborn storms. He did not speak immediately. He turned the pillow in his hands, testing its rough fabric, listening to the way the fibers rasped against his roughened skin. "I will not forget," he finally said, his voice a quiet, measured murmur that felt to him as much a vow as a confession. "But I will choose how I remember. I will choose to remember their kindness, not the fear that followed or the blame that I sometimes still taste in my mouth when I wake." A slow nod answered him from the nurse, a gesture of agreement and shared burden. The night settled into a wary peace, a truce of sorts between the man and his memory, and between the present and what could not be avoided. The following days brought a strange but welcomed change. The nurse observed that the old man's tremor had a new cadence, a repose that did not silence him, but allowed him to speak of the war as someone else might speak of a distant ancestor's tales. He told stories, not of victories or gritted teeth, but of the human connections forged within a hospital's tent walls, of the nurses who had given him a second chance by staying when they could have left, by telling him to breathe when his chest would not obey. These stories did not erase the memory's power, but they reframed its shape. The 3 nurses who had died within the memory continued to stand as the memory's most poignant, haunting figures, yet the memory's weight shifted away from an accusation toward a lesson, about mercy, about the fragility of life, about the haunting truth that one life's survival can hinge on the careful, moment-by-moment acts of strangers who become family in crisis. Rising Action's careful choreography yielded a climax that was less a moment of sudden catastrophe and more a reveal of resilience. Orion stood at the edge of the bed one night, the pillow pressed to his chest as if it were a shield again. But this time his eyes looked not toward the memory's storm but toward the window's light, a pale, stubborn gold that poured in, a daylight that had somehow learned to wait for him. He spoke to the nurse in a tone that was almost a whisper, a bestowal of a permission that had been denied him for decades, permission to live within memory rather than to dwell within its worst rooms. "I'll tell you what I remember now," he said, voice steadier than it had been in years. "I remember them as they were. 3 women who stood in the wind and rain with me, who refused to let fear claim me, and by doing so, saved my life as surely as a blade could cut away nothing but fear itself. They gave their hands and their hearts to a boy who had learned to fear his own hands more than the bullets that might come from a gun. They did not die because of me. They died because we could not save them in that moment, and I have spent a lifetime trying to honor that moment by living with it in a way that keeps it from swallowing me." The nurse listened, her own breath held for a moment, as if breathing too loudly would ruin the fragile bridge they'd built. Then she answered with something close to a celebration of his confession, though she kept her professional, measured tone. "Then we will build on that," she said. "We will build a memory that includes them in a way that is a blessing, not a burden. You deserve that, after all you've carried and given to others." A small crowd of silent mornings followed, the days of the week moving by like an old but dependable drumbeat. The old soldier's routine shifted from mere endurance to something that resembled a careful habit of living with memory in a constructive way. Journaling long, lullaby-like prayers in his mind as he lay in bed, listening to the wind wheel around the old house, smelling the smoke from someone's chimney a mile away, feeling the pillow cover's rough texture as it pressed into his hands during quiet, controlled breaths. Yet the night returned with its own stubborn thirst for telling the old story. It occurred not as a violent eruption, but as a curse of repetition, a loop that maps the same ground, sees the same figures, and refuses to depart. The 3 nurses appeared again, as if they could step through a tear in the world's fabric and stand there at the foot of his bed in their white uniforms, their faces pale but their eyes alive with concern and clear memory's path. This time the memory did not demand sacrifice. It demanded recognition, a moment in which Orion could acknowledge what had happened and what it meant to the life he had left behind him and the life he carried forward. He did not push against them. He did not cry out to their mercy or beg for a rescue. He simply faced them with a quiet, grave honesty, the kind that adults in the presence of pain learn to use when words fail. The 3 nurses stood there in the field hospital of the memory, not as enemies but as guides and, in a way, as family who had given him a future worth savoring rather than fearing. They spoke not with voice but with presence, a touch of a hand that found his shoulder, a look of reassurance, the silent communication of a shared duty that had not ended with death, but had transcended it into something more enduring, a moral obligation to keep living even when the night refuses to yield. Orion, with a deep, quiet breath, accepted that responsibility. He lowered his eyes and allowed the pillow to rest against his chest, not as a weapon but as a symbol, the symbol of a man who had learned to survive by the careful management of fear, not the abolition of fear itself. In the resolution that followed, the night's stark terror softened. The pillow no longer demanded a violent response. The bed no longer trembled with the fear of a future that could not be faced. The nurse who watched over him, patient, careful, ever present, sensed the change not as a sudden victory, but as a slow turning of the wheel, a gradual gracing of the mind with a possibility that the man who had endured a civil war in his youth could learn to endure a civil war replayed in his aging brain without surrender. The memoir of the memory, 3 nurses who died in the war's brutality, lived on, but now it lived with him and within him, rather than controlling him from the outside. The memory changed its shape. It began to resemble a map of gratitude rather than a battlefield, a map leading him toward a path of patient endurance and, occasionally, a quiet moment of relief when the night allowed him to forget again, only for a moment, and only to return with the dawn. As months turned to seasons and the old house's windows grew fogged with the breath of coming winters, Orion carried on. He kept the pillow close in the way a veteran keeps a flag close on a long march, a symbol that the war had left its mark. Yes, but that the mark could be made to stand as a monument for life rather than as a blade for death. The nurses came and went in the daylight, leaving behind a quiet care that felt almost as essential as the memory's pain. The doctor visited with a careful expression and a hopeful note, not claiming a cure but offering the possibility of a new kind of peace that could exist, if only for a little while between the tremors of night. In the end, the story, his exact story with its precise elements and its relentless truth, stood as a testament to a life that refused to be erased by memory's storms. The old veteran at 94 found a way to live with the memory's weight and to give it a shape that did not take away from his humanity, but added to it. A humanity that admits the truth of sorrow, honors the dead 3 nurses who had stood at his side in an hour of his life's greatest danger, and with a stubborn, lifelong patience learned to breathe again. And so, Orion Caro slept when he could, woke when he must, and faced the night with the pillow held not as weapon but as reminder that even in the deepest, most personal hells a man can endure, there is still something worth protecting in the living world, the voices of those who care, the quiet order of routine and ritual, and the stubborn light of memory that can sometimes, if we are brave enough to bear it, teach us to survive with dignity. The next night, as the lamp flickered and the house exhaled its heavy quiet, Orion lay still beneath the thin cotton sheet, the pillow resting peacefully in his hands. The air carried a scent of iodine and soap, and something faintly sweet, old varnish and wood, the familiar perfume of a room that had seen too much life and not enough rest. The nurse remained by his side, a quiet sentinel in a room where the past kept trying to push through the door, and where the present was learning to keep the door open just enough to let a little light in. "Rest," she finally said, the word a careful benediction. Rest in the knowledge that you have not only survived, but learned to live with what you carry. And Orion, listening to the ordinary sounds that love memory but do not worship it, closed his eyes. The pillow lay cool against his arms, its texture soothing now rather than painful. The night pressed in, but it did not swallow him. In that moment, the old veteran understood the quiet courage that the nurses had shown him, not with knives or bravado, but with a simple, unyielding commitment to keep him alive long enough to tell the truth of his life. Not with grand pronouncements,